Hey guys, Joshua Neal here, and today we're going to cover alternate tunings on heavy metal bass. Now, if you've watched any of my lesson videos, you may have noticed that a lot of the songs that I cover are in some sort of non-standard tuning, either a variation on standard tuning or some sort of drop tuning or some combination therein. And if you were unsure of how to actually find these tunings, how to get your bass into those tunings, that's something we're going to talk about today. I'm going to cover the common standard tunings and the common drop tunings that you're going to see. I'm going to show you how to get your bass into those tunings, and we're also going to talk about some special cases, 4-string versus 5-string, what you would have to consider when you're getting your bass into these alternate tunings on a 4-string and a 5-string bass. So let's get started. If you are unsure how to actually tune your bass, then this may not be the video for you. I'm not going to talk about specifically how to tune the instrument. I'm merely going to talk about the alternate tunings and how to get into them. So, tuning itself is simply assigning pitches to strings. Now, the tunings that we talk about on guitar and on bass, these are typically described from lowest pitch to highest pitch. That is the thickest string, the one that's closest to your head, that would be the lowest. Even though it's the highest in space, it's the lowest pitch string, so that's where we would start, going down to the lowest in space string, which is actually the highest pitch string. And tunings are typically named and described from the lowest string to the highest string. There are 3 common types of tunings, and then there's one extra one that I'm going to throw in for you in case you want to experiment with it. But there are 3 common types of alternate tunings. Those are standard tunings that are based on the standard E-A-D-G tuning relationship. That is one composed entirely of perfect fourths. Drop tunings, in which the lowest string is lowered or dropped one whole step. And open tunings, which are tuning the strings to a major or a minor chord. Now, these aren't as common on the bass as they are on the guitar, because the bass typically doesn't play full chords, but I'm going to talk about them today in case it's something that you want to experiment with. And then there's one bass-specific super secret special tuning that I'm going to cover at the end of this lesson that you may have already heard about, and you may not have heard about, but it's something that you can mess around with if you like. So to make this as easy as possible, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my bass, I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to show you how to find these tunings and how to get to them. So the first types of tunings we're going to talk about are standard tunings. Now, most of you, or hopefully all of you, should be familiar with just regular standard tuning, which is E, A, D, and G. If you're on a 5-string, you would have a low B down here, but we'll talk about 5 strings in a little bit. Standard tunings use what's called an all-fourths string relationship. That is, the distance between 2 adjacent strings is what's called a perfect fourth. Now, a perfect fourth is an interval. Intervals are just musical distances, but the perfect fourth is the distance from the first note to the 4th note of a major scale, or if you're not as familiar with major scales, it's the distance of 5 frets or 5 half steps. So for example, the open E to this 5th fret here, which is an A, the distance from E to A is a perfect fourth. And indeed, some of you may have learned to tune with that unison type of tuning, or you may have seen your guitarist doing that type of tuning. And then up to the B for them, because they have that major third in there. But anyway, so that's a perfect fourth, from the 1st to the 4th note of a major scale, or 5 half steps or frets. All standard tuning variations are going to follow this particular method, and all standard tuning variations are going to be named after the lowest pitch string. So whatever tuning we decide on, as long as it maintains that all-fourths relationship, we're going to name it based on whatever we tune our E string to on a 4-string bass. So let's take a look at some common examples. One of the most common standard tuning variations is what's called E-flat standard or D-sharp standard. I myself prefer to use flats when I'm talking about tunings, because we're traveling downward in pitch And typically when we make a pitch lower, we would use a flat in standard notation or in standard music notation. So I like to use flats when I'm talking about drop tunings. You can also use sharps. I will talk about them both ways just for clarity's sake. So to get your bass from E standard, which this bass is currently in, down to E flat standard or D sharp standard, you're going to tune all of your strings down 1/2 step. Now I'm using an electronic tuner over here. You can't see it, but I find that the easiest and most accurate way to tune your instrument, especially to tune your bass, is to use an electronic tuner. So what I'm going to do is drop all of my strings, or lower all of my strings 1/2 step to get me into E flat standard. So that would entail taking my E here, bringing it down to an E flat. Now my tuner does say D sharp, and that's okay. D sharp and E flat are the same note. It's just two different names for the same pitch. I'm taking my A string down to a G sharp or an A flat. Again, my tuner is using sharps. Your tuner might use flats. I'm going to take my D string down to a C sharp or a D flat, and I'm going to take my G string down to an F sharp or a G flat. So now my bass is in E flat standard, and I've got an E flat on the bottom or a D sharp. I've got an A flat or a G sharp. I've got a D flat or a C sharp, and I've got an F sharp or a G flat up top. So again, since we've down-tuned the strings equivalent amounts, each string has gone down the same amount, we're still in that standard perfect fourths relationship. There's still a fourth between these strings and these strings and these strings. The cool thing about these alternate standard tunings is that all of the scale shapes and the interval shapes and all of those riffs that you've ever learned in standard tuning, they're still going to work. They're just going to give you different pitches. So say, for example, the let's say the minor pentatonic scale. That's still going to work, even if I do it between some of the lower strings. Those are still going to work. Notable bands that have used E flat standard at one point or another, the first one that always comes to mind for me is Slayer. Slayer and their early records would always use E flat standard. They've started to get a little bit lower in recent years, but a lot of their early records were E flat standards. Other bands, Gwar uses E flat standard a lot. If you've seen my lesson for the Uberclaw, we're in E flat standard on that one. And then the other big band that I always think of, at least on their earlier records, is Cannibal Corpse. That kind of thing. Another standard tuning variation that we see quite a bit in heavy metal music is D standard. And what that entails is taking your standard tuned bass and you would drop all of your strings a full step. So what I'm actually going to do, to make it easier for you guys to see it, I'm going to tune my bass real quick back up to E standard, or a reasonable approximation of E standard. Get them as close as I can. So now I'm back into E standard. Got E, A, D, G again. If I wanted to get to D standard, I'm going to drop all of my strings a full step. So the low E is going to come down to a D, all the way past D sharp into D. My A is going to go down past G sharp to G natural. My D is going to come down to a C, and my G is coming down all the way past F sharp right to F natural. So I've got, on the low end, I've got a D natural rather. It was not quite in tune, so I'm going to fix it. I've got a G natural. I've got a C natural and an F. So D, G, C, F. Now, just a little sidebar, I've noticed that the further down you tune, if you're going from standard tuning to a lower standard tuning or a dropped tuning, because you're releasing tension on the strings, you're taking a lot of tension off the neck. What's going to happen is as you down tune these strings, it's going to throw all the other strings a little bit sharp. So if you've gone through, you've tuned your E down to a D, you've tuned your A down to a G, your D down to a C, and your G down to an F, go back and double check all of the strings. Like I went back and double checked just now and I found that my D string was incredibly sharp. It was almost a D sharp because I had taken so much tension off the neck from the other strings. So always double check when you down tune. If you are setting up your bass to be permanently down tuned, you like to keep it in D standard or C or drop tuning or whatever, you're not going to run into this problem. It's when you're slingshotting between a standard tuning and a lowered tuning or a drop tuning, that's when you'll run into this problem. So we're in D standard, we've got D, G, C, and F. A lot of classic metal bands, especially classic death metal bands, this was one of the first super low tunings that you started coming across when death metal bands were looking to differentiate themselves from the hair metal bands or the thrash metal bands who typically didn't down tune or didn't down tune that far. They said, well, these guys are in E or an E flat. We're going to go super low. We're going to take it all the way down to D. So that's what they did. And one of the band I always think of that does this, or that used to do this, is Death. Death would always tune in D standard. If you've seen my lesson on Inhuman Form by Death, we were in D standard for that. Another band, a more modern band that does this tuning plenty or used to do this tuning plenty is Mastodon. They would also do a weird variation where they drop the D string all the way down to an A, so they'd have A, G, C, and F. And another band that does this is the progressive death metal band or the technical death metal band Obscura, which contains one of my favorite bass players of all time, a guy named Jaron Paul Fesseling, who played, no longer in the band, but played the 6-string fretless bass and just kept up with the guitar players with these ridiculous riffs, which was very cool. Moving on to the next tuning, I'm going to take it all the way back up to a G, take this guy up to a D. I'm going to take this one up to an A, and I'm going to take the D back up to an E. So I'm back in standard tuning, or reasonably close to standard tuning. Another step down, there is also D flat standard or C sharp standard, where you would go a half step below D standard or a minor third below E standard. Black Sabbath used to do this on their earlier records because Tony Iommi wanted to slacken the strings so that they'd be easier to play, because he, again, was missing some fingertips from an industrial accident. I'm going to skip over D flat standard, though. I'm going to go right to C standard. We're going to take all of our strings down a major third, or 2 whole steps in this case. So our E string is going to come all the way down, all the way down, all the way down to a C. And our A string comes all the way down past G, past F sharp, comes to F. Our D string is going to come all the way down past C sharp, past C, past B, all the way to B flat. If we're going to name it as based on C, we would be naming it as a B flat. Your tuner might say B flat, it might also say A sharp. Again, both are just different names for the same pitch. So my tuner, for example, does say A sharp. So I'm going to tune it to an A sharp, and then my G is going to come all the way down past F sharp, past F, past E, and it should be E flat. My tuner is choosing to say D sharp, which is okay. I'm now going to go back and double check that C is incredibly sharp. The F is also pretty darn sharp. Bring that in tune. The A sharp is a little out, and the D sharp is pretty close. So C standard, we've got C, F, B flat or A sharp, E flat or D sharp. This is getting real low. This is where you get into the a lot of the stoner metal bands, or the older stoner or kind of doom metal type bands would use this tuning. Sleep, for example. That kind of stuff. The strings get real easy to bend when they're down tuned this far, which is great. That kind of thing. Carcass would use this tuning on some of their earlier records. As they progressed, they started to get down to a different tuning, which I'll talk about in a second. The Sword, if you've listened to them, they're kind of pioneers of the retro metal, the vintage semi-stoner metal. Everything's about wizards and flying through space and things like that. It's very cool. If you haven't checked it out, you should. But the Sword is typically in this tuning. That kind of thing. And then everybody's favorite fictional metal band, Death Clock, is also in C standard as well. Getting down here, we start to get into, I'm sure you can hear it when I'm playing, but the strings are starting to get very, very loose. I'm starting to get a lot of fret noise. They don't sound quite as meaty as they used to. If I was going to leave my strings in this low tuning all the time, I would set up my bass to accommodate it. I would raise up my action a little bit. I might even switch to higher gauge strings if I felt like it, and I would set my tone shaping controls, my preamp, for example, to help me accommodate this tuning. And the last standard variation we're going to talk about is B standard. I'm not going to tune all the way up because it's going to take forever. This is a half step below C standard. So just real quick, I'm going to knock this one out. Or as close as I can. I'm taking everything a half step down. A lot of fret buzz there. I'm going to jump back up here to make sure everything's cool. Lots and lots of fret noise. My bass is not set up to take this low of a tuning right now, so I'm going to get a lot of fret noise. I'm going to get some dead notes. Things are not going to be as cool as I would like them to be. But B standard, this is also the lowest 4 strings on a 5-string bass. If you have a 5-string bass in standard tuning, you are already in B standard. You do not need to do anything. But if you're like me, you're using a 4-string, you want to get that low B in there, or you want to double up some guitar players that are in B standard, this is the way you would do it. From lowest to highest, we have B, E, A, and D. Now, a band that uses B standard, has been using B standard for a really long time, is Aborted. If you've seen that, again, constantly name checking my lessons, but I did a lesson on meticulous invagination, which is in B standard. And that's normally with a pick. I just don't feel like grabbing one. At the Gates also would tune in B standard. And Dismember is another band that gets down into B standard. Now, whatever standard tuning you're using, all standard tunings can be constructed using this perfect fourths method, and they would all be constructed, or all be named rather, from the lowest string, in this case on the 4-string. So if I wanted to keep going, if I wanted to be an A standard on a 4-string bass, I would need some very heavy strings, but it would be A, D, G, and C. If I wanted to be in G standard, it would be G, C, F, and B flat. And the list keeps going on and on. Any of the sharps and flats that I didn't cover between these standard tunings, you would also find them the exact same way. So to summarize, all standard tunings use an all-fourths string relationship. The perfect fourth is the distance from the first note to the fourth note of the major scale, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 half steps, or 5 frets. And all variations on standard tuning are named after the lowest pitch string. And now we're going to move into the drop tunings. So just give me a moment. I'm going to tune it back up into standard tuning. And bring it up to E. Since I was tuned a perfect fourth down, I'm going to double check everything. You don't have as much of the issues when you're tuning back up because you're tightening the strings, but it's always good to double check. All right. So now we're talking about drop tunings. Now a drop tuning is going to start with a standard tuning. Whatever standard tuning you like, you can get an additional tuning out of your standard tuning by taking your lowest pitch string and then lowering it some more or dropping it. And the typical drop distance for a drop tuning is 1 whole step. The cool thing about these drop tunings on the guitar, or the reason that guitarists get into them, is they allow chord shapes that aren't possible in a standard tuning. In hard rock and heavy metal, they allow for 1-finger power chords, which allows a guitarist to play a single note riff with complete power chords, which is going to really thicken it up. On bass, a drop tuning is not only going to allow you to accurately double and keep up with the guitar, if that's your intention, but it would also allow for larger intervals. Just like guitarists can achieve chords that they normally couldn't achieve in a standard tuning, we can achieve much, much larger shapes. We have a much larger reach because this string has gone down a little bit. So, just like standard tunings used a perfect fourth relationship, drop tunings also have a special relationship. Specifically, the distance between the lowest string and the next lowest string. On a 5 string, they're going to be down here, but on a 4 string, the distance between your normal E and A string is going to be a perfect fifth. Now, this is a little bit larger than a perfect fourth. It's the distance from, you guessed it, the first to the 5th note of the major scale. It's also the distance of 7 half steps or 7 frets. So open to 7th fret, that is a perfect fifth. And I'll show you how they match up when we check out. The most common drop tuning that you are going to see throughout your career is drop D, and I'm going to get to that right now. I'm not going to touch E, A, or G. I'm sorry, E, D, or G. No, A, D, or G. That was completely wrong. I'm not going to touch the A string or the D string or the G string. I am going to take the low E string and I'm going to lower it 1 whole step past D sharp all the way to D. Right about there. So what you'll notice immediately is that the low string and the D string in this case, so the 4th string and the 2nd string on my 4-string bass are now 1 octave apart. So octaves, which are normally up 2 over 2, are now just up 2. I can now find these shapes very, very easily. I can reach these ninths very easily, these minor tenths or these minor thirds up an octave. It's very easy to find 11ths, sharp 4s, fifths. I can do these gigantic kind of power chord shapes. Again, I'm kind of getting into what guitar players do, but you can do them on bass as well. That kind of thing. Also gives you this cool pentatonic type scale down here. And if that sounded like Tool, it's because it kind of was. Tool is a band that uses drop D almost exclusively. They get into some weird variations on some of their other records, but the odds of a Tool song being in drop D are pretty high. A more modern band that uses drop D tuning is Battlecross, is always in drop D, and Lamb of God also gets into drop D. That kind of stuff. Now, if I wanted to go even further, I could start with E flat standard, where I tune all of my strings down a half step and then drop that lowest string down another half step, or drop that lowest string down a full step at that point. So I'm going to stay in drop D, and I'm going to just lower everything a half step to save time. So the G comes down to an F sharp or a G flat, the D comes down to a C sharp or a D flat, the A comes down to a G sharp or an A flat, and this D, which was already dropped, is going to come down to a C sharp or a D flat. So at this point I have D flat, A flat, D flat, and G flat. This would be called drop G, or drop D flat, or drop C sharp. Works the same way as drop D, just everything is down a further half step. Bands that have used this tuning at some point, Avenged Sevenfold likes to use it a lot. Children of Bodom has gotten into it at times, and the Deftones as well. If I wanted to go even lower with my drop tunings, I could take them down another half step. So my F sharp came down to an F, my C sharp comes down to a C, my G sharp comes down to a G. Went a little too far, I'm going to bring it back up. Come on, there it is. And my C sharp is going to come down to a C. So this would be called, you guessed it, drop C. C, G, C, and F. A lot of bands get into drop C at some point. Gojira is one of them, especially on their newer records. Converge has gotten into drop C, and the most common band that I always think of when I think of drop C is System of a Down. Or if you've ever heard that song, that's in drop C, getting a little heavier again. Strings are getting a little floppy at this point. I would want to raise up my action a bit or get some thicker strings. Definitely set up the instrument to accommodate this tuning. And one more we're going to cover. I'm going to go down yet another half step. So F came down to an E, C came down to a B. This G is going to come down to an F sharp. And this C is going to come down one more half step eventually to a B. About there. So I've got B, F sharp, B, and E. And this one is called, of course, drop B. We still have that perfect fifth relationship between the strings. Everything else is a perfect fourth. This one's a fifth, fourth, fourth. Bands that get into drop B, Machine Head is a big fan of it. They actually do drop B, but they tune it, I think, 40 cents sharp, so they're kind of halfway between drop B and drop C. Slipknot, again, another band that gets into drop B, and again, another band that does drop B a little bit out of tune. They go up to about A445 when they tune in drop B. And another band, again, that I used to listen to a lot when I was younger, Mudvayne, was in drop B for a little while, then they kind of drifted into drop C, and I think they drifted back. But again, with all of these drop tunings, they can all be constructed using this method. You can start with any standard tuning that you like, and then take the lowest pitch string and drop it yet again a whole step, an entire step, so that you have a perfect fifth, the distance from the first to the fifth note of the major scale between this low string and this next lowest string. That's how you will find any drop tuning. Now, real quick, let's tune back up. All right, now we will talk about open tunings. Now, again, open tunings are not very common on bass because they involve tuning the strings to a major chord or a minor chord. Usually it's a major chord, but there are minor chord open tunings. Not as common on the bass because we don't need to play full chords very often, but they can be fun to experiment with a little bit. I'll give you a couple examples and I'll tune to one just to show you what I'm talking about. Some of the more common guitar open tunings would be open G, where you would have the E string would come down to a D, the A would come down to a G, and then some of the upper strings would move as well, but we don't have to deal with those because we're playing a 4-string bass. On the bass, if you wanted to duplicate that tuning to some extent, you would have D, G, D, and G. So you would actually have two of the same strings just an octave apart, which would make it very easy to play a simple line on a lower string and then play that exact same line one octave higher without having to shift up. You would just change strings across the bass. The easiest one on bass that would actually give you the notes of an open chord would be open D. And if I was to do open D, I would take my E string down to a D. I would take my A string nowhere, nor my D string, and my G would come down to an F sharp. So we would have D, A, another D, F sharp. If I was to say play this with harmonics, I get this nice D major chord right there. It's very easy to find major chords now because they're all spaced across the strings on the same fret. Now, I haven't experimented with these tunings really at all because I don't do a whole lot of chordal. I'm more of a support bass player. I'm not really a lead bass player. But if you wanted easy access to these kind of melodic things, if you wanted to do that kind of drone thing that I was just making up right there, if you wanted to do that sort of drone stuff, maybe with a whole bunch of delay or use a loop pedal, open tunings could be a good thing for you to check out. And the other open tuning that you might see on the bass would be open C, which would be C, G, C, and G. And the only reason, or the biggest reason that I bring up this particular tuning is because Devin Townsend, one of my favorite musicians and favorite songwriters of the band Strapping Young Lad, also his solo projects, Devin Townsend Band, Devin Townsend Project, all of that good stuff. He tunes exclusively in this type of open tuning. He started to drift downwards with it, but he originally started playing in open C, which is C, G, C, G, and then C and E on the high 2 strings. And this is interesting to know because that is the tuning for the song Friends by Led Zeppelin. Apparently he learned to play the song when he was younger, and he just never tuned his guitar back to standard tuning ever again. So, before we look at the next one, or the next tuning, let me just get back in standard tuning real quick. So going into standard tuning, there we go. So I mentioned at the beginning of the video I was going to show you a super secret special instrument tuning that we can do on the bass. And now we're going to talk about that. And I kind of just gave away the name of it. This is a special category called instrument tunings, and this is where you tune your strings to match another instrument that is not the bass. They are less common than standard variations or drop tunings, but they are more common than open tunings. They can open up new shapes and new ideas, kind of like the open tunings, because you've got your bass set up in a way that you never get to deal with. Now, the one that you're going to see most commonly, I think, on the electric bass is what's called cello tuning, and that is where you tune the strings of the bass to be like the cello. It's going to be an octave below the cello, but the cello and also the viola and the violin, the other instruments of the strings family, typically tune in all fifths. They have a perfect fifth between all of the strings. This is in contrast to the electric bass and its predecessor, the double bass, which is tuned in all fourths. The double bass is kind of the black sheep of the orchestra in that respect. If I wanted to be in cello tuning, I would set my strings to be C, G, D, and A. So the E string and the A string would come down. The D string gets to stay put. That lines up, but the G string actually has to get tuned up. I will try this very, very quickly. And if I break a string, you guys owe me a new one. There we go. Taking it down a little further. Almost there. Okay. Double check this guy, because other stuff changed. So, I'm now tuned like an octaved cello. I have a C, a G, a D, and an A. And the cool thing about this tuning is now I have access to fifths. It's like I have a bunch of drop tunings stacked on top of each other. So if I wanted to play power chords, I could do so very easily. Now, the only bassist that I can think of off the top of my head that uses this particular tuning is Brian Gibson of the duo Lightning Bolt. He actually has always tuned his bass, as far as I know, in cello tuning. Now, what he does, because you don't typically want to tune strings up, and I'm actually going to do it right now. I'm going to get this string back to normal pitch just so I don't keep putting tension on it. You'd want to go with a much lighter gauge G string so that you could tune it up. I know Brian Gibson has at times, and might still at this point, he actually puts a banjo string up here, something that's designed to be tuned to a higher pitch so that he can accommodate that. But if you're looking for something fun to do, if you feel like maybe you've hit a wall with the stuff you can do on the bass, and you want to try something neat and interesting and a little weird, cello tuning, C, G, D, A, could be a good way to go. Okay, 5 and 6 stringers. I've been talking about it the entire lesson. Now I'm going to cover specifically how to handle these alternate tunings on a 5 and 6 string bass, especially the little special cases that you get into. Now, completely contradicting what I just did in the previous part of the lesson, except in very rare cases, we never tune higher than the standard pitch that the strings are designed to take. This puts a lot of tension on the strings. It makes them much, much harder to pluck, and it increases the chance of string breakage. Now, there are some people that disagree with this, Brian Beller being one of them. Brian Beller is an accomplished performer and educator. He plays with the Aristocrats, but most of you probably know him as the bass player for Death Clock. And what he does is he actually takes the lowest 4 strings of a 5-string set, puts them on his 4-string bass, and then tunes them up a half step. So instead of B, E, A, D, he gets C, F, B flat, E flat. He tunes these guys up to C standard because he likes that incredible tension and the tone that he gets out of it. It's something that I don't like to do. So for the rest of the lesson that I'm going to be talking about, we're going to assume that we do not tune higher than standard when we do this. Now, some of you may have run into this problem, especially as the guitar players start tuning lower and lower. How do we accommodate this low string in here? Say we want it to be in the drop B tuning, B, F sharp, B, E, and then any other high strings above it. Now, we never tune higher than standard, so it would be improper or incorrect or whatever you want to call it to tune this E string up to an F sharp and then tune this A string up to a B and so on. That would put a lot of tension on the strings. They'd be very difficult to play. There's a good chance they could break. It's something we don't want to do. So how do we handle these alternate tunings? For matching up your tunings with a 6-string guitarist, and that's the key, a 6-string guitarist, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you are going to use your E string as the lowest note in the tuning. Remember, we use the lowest note and to name the tuning, and we tune our strings based on that. You're going to use your E string, even though it's not your lowest string. We're going to treat it as our lowest note in the tuning, and we're going to tune the B string lower than that, specifically a perfect fourth lower than that, so that we can match up with our guitars. So for example, if I wanted to be in D standard, I would take my E string all the way down to a D. I would take my A string down to a G, a little too far. I would take my D string down to a C. I would take my G down to an F. So I've got D standard on these 4 strings. Now if I want to maintain that all fourths relationship so that all the shapes that I know and love are going to work out, I would take this B string and also tune it down a full step. Specifically, I'm going to tune it down to an A. And hopefully the tuner lets me do that. Sometimes these clip-on tuners don't like low bass notes, but it is working pretty well for me right now. Okay, so D standard on a 5-string bass. I've got my D, my G, my C, and my F, but I've also got this ultra low A that I can use. Got these low notes. I can do these low kind of scale shapes that are a lot of fun. A band that uses this particular tuning, or that the bass player uses this particular tuning, is, again, Obscura. The Obscura is usually in D standard because the bassist is using a 6-string bass. He has this extra low string that he can throw in, so he tunes that down to an A so that it matches up with everything. If I wanted to go even lower than that, say, if I wanted to be in C standard, I would take all of my strings down a further step. So I'm going to take my F down to an E flat or a G sharp, or a D sharp rather. I'm going to take my C string, formerly D string, comes down to an A sharp, B flat. My G, which used to be an A, is coming down to an F. My D, which was the E, is coming down to a C. So now I've got C standard on my 4 strings here, C, F, B flat, and E flat. If I want to maintain that perfect fourths relationship, I got to tune this low string down to a G, and this one is definitely not going to like it. This tuner is definitely not going to like it, so I'm going to use this harmonic here, because the 12th fret harmonic is exactly the same as the 12th fret note, which is an octave above the open string. So in a pinch, something like this will work. There we go. So for C standard, I've got C, F, B flat, and E flat, and I've got this ultra low G on the bottom. Now if I wanted to do this with, say, a drop tuning, so I'm going to tune back up to standard real quick, fast as I can. Because I was way out, I'm going to double check just to make sure everything is perfectly in tune. Good, on that one moved. Okay, back in standard tuning. If I wanted to do this for a drop tuning, let's use drop D as an example. On a 4-string, I would take my low E down to a D. Now I want to maintain some semblance of a relationship between the strings so that they make sense to me. You could leave this as a B. I find that very, very confusing. I don't like having minor thirds between my strings. It messes me up. So what I'm going to do, I took this string down to be an octave below my D string. I'm going to take my B string down to be an octave below my A string. And I'm going to use the harmonic just to make sure everything's good. There we go. So I've got my 4-string drop D, D, A, D, and G. I've taken my B string down to an A, so I actually have A, D, G. I can use this as my main string when I'm playing along with the guitar players. If I want to throw in some low stuff, I can do that. If I want to come up with a line on the D string, I can then move it down an octave. Absolutely no problem, and this would work for any other drop tuning as well. Now, once we get at or below B standard, remember on a 5-string bass, the standard tuning, which I'm going to get back to very quickly. Sure everything's good. On a 5-string bass, the standard tuning would technically be B standard because our lowest pitched string is a B. So B, E, A, D, and G. If you have a 6-string, you would have a C up here. Not going to worry about that right now. Once we're at or below this B standard, or if we're matching up with a 7-string guitarist because they also have a low B, we can use the B string now as a lowest note, have it make sense. If we wanted to use a drop tuning in this case, we would keep that perfect fifth relationship between the low B string and the next string rather than between the E and the A string like we did if we're matching up a 6-string guitarist or if we're above B standard. So for example, if I wanted to match up with my guitar player, say we're doing some covers of Korn tunes in A standard. They use, or at least they did on their earlier records, they use 7-string guitars and a 5-string bass, and they tune to A standard. So what I would do is drop all of my strings a full step. It's like going to D standard on a 4-string bass. I'm going to take my G down to an F. I'm going to take my D down to a C. I'm going to take my A down to a G. I'm going to take my E down to a D. Went a little too far. And I'm going to take my B down to an A. As best I can. There we go. So you may be saying, well, that's exactly the same as D standard. And you're right. If we were dealing with a 6-string guitarist, or if we were thinking in terms of a 4-string bass, we would tune the 4-string part of the bass to D standard, and we would lower this one just to keep that all-fourths relationship. Now, you could also call this A standard because we are maintaining that perfect fourths relationship between the strings, which is what we do in a standard tuning, but the lowest pitched string is now an A. So we have A, D, G, C, and F. We're in A standard. Again, if we're matching up with a 7-string guitarist, that's what we would call it. Or if we're matching up with a 6-string guitarist that has gone below B standard, we would call this A standard. Otherwise, we'd think of it as D standard. This would be our main string, and this is just some gravy on top that we can throw in some super low bowel loosening notes if we really want to. Same kind of thing here. If you wanted to go into a drop tuning and we're below B standard, or say we're playing with a 7-string guitarist, say we just joined up with Whitechapel and we want to get down to drop G. I'm already in A standard. I'm going to take my low A string and I'm going to drop it all the way to a G. I've now got my perfect fifth relationship between these two strings. We've got a G and a D, G, C, and F. So we can now do our super low breakdown kind of riff. that kind of thing. So just to review, with these 5 and 6 string tunings, except in very rare cases, we do not tune higher than the standard pitch of the strings. It puts a lot of tension on those strings. It makes them harder to play and to pluck, and it increases the chance of breaking a string. If we want to match up our tuning with a 6-string guitarist, we are going to use the E string as our lowest note, even though it's not technically the lowest note on the instrument. We will tune our low B string a perfect fourth below that. If we are at or below B standard on a 6-string guitar, or we are trying to match up with a 7-string guitarist who also has this low B, we don't have to do any of that silly, confusing stuff. We can use the low B string as our lowest note. If we were to have a drop tuning, we would keep that perfect fifth between the B string and the E string. If we're in a standard tuning, it's fourths all the way up. There it is, guys. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. If you did, be sure to click like and let me know. You can also leave me a comment or a question. I know some of these alternate standard and drop tunings can be a little confusing, so if you have any questions about anything that I've covered today, be sure to leave me a comment, and I do my best to get back to every single one of those, so I will try my best to help you out. If you like these videos, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any future updates. I'm always doing song lessons and covers and these technique and theory videos to help you out. So be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any future lessons. Again, if you have a comment or a question, please let me know. I will get back to you. And until next time,